Hi, this is going to be a lecture on virtual private cloud. So what is virtual private cloud? So virtual private cloud is basically the networking part of GCP. So let's delve into it. So what is networking? So networking is basically group of computers linked together that enable them to communicate as well as share resources with each other. So what VPC is basically the mesh on which all virtual machines are basically connected. So the important thing you should remember is that communication is basically what networking is all about. How two resources or multiple resources can communicate with each other. So the reason why we have virtual private cloud in GCP is because it provides connectivity for compute engines to communicate with each other, and not only just compute engines, it also helps in app engines and Kubernetes to communicate with each other. The other important thing is that it enables virtual it enables virtual machines to communicate with on-premise networks, as well as it enables internal and external load balancing. So these are basically the fundamental uses of VPC. It is also important to know that VPC is it's not a physical construct, but it is basically a software construct, and there is no real implicit network that is created. It's all done using software. The other important thing to note is that VPC is a global network, unlike AWS and Azure, which is basically a regional construct. So whenever you create a virtual network in AWS or in Azure, it's basically restricted to that particular region. That is not the case with the GCP private private network. You can create a virtual private network in GCP and you can have it across multiple regions, and you can make sure that virtual machines communicate with each other even though they are in different geographical locations using their internal IP addresses. So let's start constructing a VPC in GCP. So the first thing you construct is a GCP project. So once you've created a GCP project, the second thing you create is the VPC itself. So the VPC can have any RFC 1918 ranges. So here I have constructed one with the range 10, 128.0.0.9. So this can have a host address ranging from 128.0.1 to 255, 254, and it can have a large number of hosts within it. So after you've created the VPC, the second thing you create is basically a subnet. A subnet is a regional construct, so each subnet can reside within one particular region. So here I have three regions: US East 1, US West 1, and US East 2. So what I'll create is I'll create three subnets within these three regions. Sorry, I'll create four subnets. So as you can see that I have created subnet 3 and subnet 4 within the same region. That is possible. The thing that is not possible is creating one subnet spanning across multiple regions. So one subnet can exist only in one region. So here I have created subnets and I have partitioned them in such a way that the subnet IP addresses do not overlap each other. And within these subnets, you can actually have multiple zones. So for example, the US East subnet has 3 zones in them. So I have taken one particular zone and I have created a virtual machines within them. So that's how it's basically constructed. So when you see a virtual machine, it'll reside in one particular zone, and that particular zone is part of a subnet. And that subnet is basically overall a part of a VPC network. And using firewalls, you can actually have rules which enables communication, both ingress and egress communication to the internet. So the things you have to note is once you create your GCP project, you have to create your VPC network, and then after that you have to create a subnet. And after you've created the subnet, you have to create firewall rules that will enable them to communicate both within and both outside the internet. or should I say both ingress and egress traffic. There are two ways in which you can create a VPC in Google Cloud. There is the auto mode and there is the custom mode. So the auto mode is basically constructing a network with the IP range of 10.128.0.0.9, and a subnet is created in each region. So this is important to note. And if you're creating it in custom mode, which is basically the preferred way if you want to deploy anything in production, you can basically choose your own CIDR block as long as it's RFC 1918, and you can create subnets according to your wish. You can create subnets in the regions that you think has maximum traffic. VPC firewall rules lets you to allow and deny connections to and from your virtual machines. So there are implied rules and there are rules that you have to define. The implied rule is that it allows all egress traffic to communicate with the virtual machine within that particular VPC network. So any traffic that goes out of the network is allowed. However, the ingress rule is also set as denied. So any traffic initially, if you've not set up your firewall, will not let in any traffic into your network. So that is important to note. So if you're creating a custom VPC, you have to make sure that your firewall rules are set. The other important thing to note is that once you create a GCP account, it comes default with a network, which is called as a default network. So you can go check your console, go to your VPC tag and see whether it's been created or not. So if you are logging into GCP for the first time, it will be created for you. So once you go into your GCP console and once you go into your VPC session, if you click on the firewalls tab, you will see that there are certain pre-populated firewall rules that are already created for you. So what are these rules? So these rules are basically rules that allow any network to communicate with your, or any, should I say, any machine to communicate with virtual machines that you create within your default VPC network. So for example, if you do a ping to a virtual machine that is within your default network, it does connect. So the reason for that is that there are certain rules that are created by default in your default network. So the first rule is basically the ICMP rule. This is the default network and the direction is ingress with a priority and a range. So what this rule defines is that any traffic that is going into your default network will be allowed as long as it's basically an ICMP protocol. Similarly, if you do an RDP or an SSH, that is if you try to log in using PuTTY, so that is also allowed using your TCP 3389 if it's RDP and 22 if it's SSH. So that is the reason why if you have created a virtual machine in your default network, you are able to communicate with that you using PuTTY. So that is one of the reasons why it's not advisable to use your default network if you in your production environment. So you have to also make sure that these rules are not applicable for you if you want to create your custom virtual networks. I hope this was useful for you. If you have any doubts, please ping me or get in touch with me. Thank you.